Before you can intelligently discuss ethical topics, you have to be able to intelligently discuss. In other words, reason correctly, right? So there are certain rules about syllogism that we will learn about. And so logic is defined as the science of correct thinking. There is a science to it. And the broader sense of science than the empirical scientific method uses the term. Okay, so we'll talk about that a little bit tomorrow. Ethics is defined as the science of correct human behavior. So, but before we can get to ethics, we have to talk about some other branches of philosophy. Those are both considered disciplines of philosophy. And if you go to a good philosophy program in college, you would take sequentially logic first, and then you would take philosophy of knowledge, and then you would take philosophy of being, or metaphysics it's called. Philosophy of knowledge I'll be referring to as gnoseology, sometimes it's called epistemology. And so after metaphysics, you'll have philosophical anthropology, or philosophy of the human being. Okay, and then you'll have ethics, and you'll throw in there philosophy of nature, philosophy of science, etc. But ethics usually is one of the last things you cover. So, in other words, I'm going to rush through introducing a bunch of philosophical concepts before getting to ethics proper. Okay. Before we can know what correct human behavior is, we have to know what the human being is. Before we can know what the human being is, we have to know what a being is. Before we can know what a being is, we have to know whether or not it's possible to know at all. And before we can know whether or not it's possible to know, we have to think correctly. So, we start with logic, and then we move on to philosophy of knowledge, gnoseology, and we'll learn the theories of knowledge. And theories of knowledge are very important for understanding the theories of morality, because theories of morality are based on the theories of knowledge. So if you don't know the theories of knowledge, you won't understand the theories of morality. Okay, so this isn't a theology class, so the first couple are a little irrelevant, except to say that ethics is not necessarily Christian or non-Christian. Okay? It's just a branch of philosophy. It's not religious or non-religious. Okay, it's a philosophical discipline. Well, obviously this is a Catholic school, so I might give Catholic examples here and there to illustrate things. And let's see. So, reasons to study logic would be to improve one's thinking. So, let me blow this up a little bit. Oops. So, if you learn logic, that helps you reason more correctly. In other words, it helps you to avoid the common logical fallacies that we discussed last time. Okay? So that we all tend to fall into those fallacies. Ignore what's bold for today. That's for tomorrow. I didn't go over it in the other classes. The meaning of science. But, so we have logic as the art and science of correct thinking. We talked about that. Now, while I was given all those examples of if God exists, then he's a squirrel, blah, blah, blah. Okay, that was to show that logic only has to do, strictly speaking, with the agreement between ideas, the coherence of ideas. Whether those things exist or not in reality is irrelevant. Okay, so if you study like symbolic logic, it'll be all this A, B, blah, 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 and there's a lot of other letters that I'll introduce later, and it's kind of like math. Okay, so it has very little to do with what actually exists in the world. So that's the formal, what's called the formal aspect of reasoning, or formal logic. Material logic will come later, and that's otherwise known as philosophy of knowledge. And that is after you follow the process correctly. So there's, you follow the process correctly or incorrectly. We're learned denying the antecedent and affirming the consequent are common fallacies. Those have to do with the process themselves. Some of those fallacies we'll talk about later have more to do with gnoseology, or the theory of knowledge. And so those would have to do with the agreement of the mind with the reality. So it's one thing to follow the process correctly. It's another thing to ask, is this premise true or not? Okay, does it agree with reality, or does it just not make any sense? So moving on from that point, without giving examples, I gave examples last time. We'll give examples next time. There's fundamental thing to learn in logic and the philosophy of knowledge from a different perspective is the 3 acts of the mind. Okay, so we're going to introduce a good deal of terminology here. Some of these terms are more important than others. We'll use some of these terms later on when we're talking about ethical topics. But first, the 3 acts of the mind. Okay, so we have this. A is B, B is C, therefore A is C. That's a syllogism, okay? And these are all premises. They're also all judgments. Okay, now, A is C is the inference that comes forth from joining these 2 judgments together. So this whole thing is a syllogism, but the conclusion itself that we draw from these premises is called an inference. That's the 3rd act of the mind. So that's the goal, okay? Reasoning, argument. That's the goal of the acts of the mind. That's the final act of the mind. Moving backwards, you can't get to an inference without judgments. Okay? The judgment is linking together 2 or more concepts. Okay, so inference is linking together 2 or more judgments, and judgment is linking together 2 or more concepts. Okay, so here the concepts are represented by letters. Okay, so A is a concept, B is a concept, C is a concept. Okay, whenever I say A is B, that's a judgment. All right. So a judgment is anytime I say something of another. Another word for that is anytime I predicate something of another. It's another term there, predication. So if you remember your grammar, you have the subject position, A, right? And B would be in the predicate position here. Here, B is in the subject position and C is in the predicate position. All right, so we're predicating B of A. We're predicating C of B. Okay, just terminology. Now, we link the 2 concepts together by means of what's called a copula. Is or is not. Okay, so we're linking the 2 concepts together by the copula, and we link the 2 judgments together by the middle term, which we talked about last time. Okay, so what exactly, though, is a concept? So conceptualization is the 1st act of the mind because it's the process by which we arrive at concepts. Okay, so when I'm a little baby, or any little baby, think of my daughter, okay, she's just now starting to name things. So she knows mama and dada, but little babies at her age, she's not even 1 yet, usually when they see somebody else, they'll call them mama and dada too. So see another woman, she'll call her mama. Most likely, for some reason, they tell the difference between sexes before they tell the difference between other things. But then they see another guy, and they'll call that guy dada. Okay, so she don't really get the concept yet of what mama and dada is. But at some point, something will click, and she'll say, "Hey, that's not my mama. That's a different thing, whatever it is. You know, it's a different woman. This is my mama. Okay, or that's not my dada. This is my dada." Okay, so another example. When I was a kid, I used to have to name cars, and I had a concept of a car at this point. I had to walk around and touch the car and say car, car, car. My parents would pull me away because I had to go somewhere and go, no! I wanted to touch the car and say car. Okay, car. So why was I doing that? I didn't go up to a desk and say car. I didn't go up to a podium and say car. I knew what a car was. I knew what it looked like, more or less, right? So we form these concepts. So a concept is what we call a universal or a category in which many particular things participate. So this is a desk, and this is a desk, and this is a desk. They're all slightly different. They're particular desks, right? They're slightly different from each other, but they all belong to the category desk, okay? And this is a podium, and this particular thing here belongs to the category podium, however I want to define podium, right? And every possible podium in the world belongs to the category, the idea that I have of podium. I'm imagining another podium over there, and it belongs to the concept podium, even though it doesn't exist, okay? So, in other words, the concept is a universal. It's a broad category in which many particular things participate. Okay, it's not just an image in the brain. So we have conceptualization as the process by which we arrive at those concepts, and there are different theories about how we do that. But we won't talk about. And then judgment, linking together concepts. So when I say this marker is black, I have to know first the concepts, marker. This thing right here falls in the category marker. And then when I see black, oh, that thing right there falls in the category of the color black. So those are two concepts, black and marker, and I link them together. And I say this marker is black. And that's a judgment. Okay? I predicate black of the marker by means of a copula. So, then, on top of that, we have Aristotle. He's a really smart guy. He was like the founder of logic as a science. And he was also a biologist, a physician. He started out that way, and he started writing philosophy. That's what he's most known for. So he came up, he said, okay, so how many different kinds of predicates are there? I can predicate black of this marker. What else can I predicate about it? What else can I say about the marker? I can say it's small. I can say it has this shape. Blah, 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 right? Now, what are the different types of predicates that exist? All the different types of predicates that exist. How can I categorize the predicates? Well, he comes up with 10 categories of predicates. 10 different types of things you can say about other things. All right? So, it's not so important that you understand all the predicates, what they mean exactly, but it's important that you know the difference between substance and accidents. Okay? The first category is substance. Substance is not exactly the same as what it means in biology or chemistry, excuse me. But it's broadly speaking, it just means what exists in itself. Okay, so to give a different example, this shirt. This is a shirt. Okay, that's the substantial predication. Now I can predicate other types of predicates of the shirt. I can say, this shirt is blue. Okay, I'm predicating a quality. Colors are qualities of things. So I'm predicating blue of the shirt. So blue is a type of accident. An accident doesn't mean what we typically mean by accident, like you run into something, whatever. It just means, in philosophy, it comes from the Latin, unfortunate translation, we haven't come up with a better word for it lately, is what exists in another. Okay, so substance is what exists in itself, accident is what exists in another. The blue color does not exist by itself, it just exists in the shirt. Right? The shirt exists in itself. Right? It could be a different color. It could change all kinds of accidents. Its size could change, its shape could change, et cetera, and still be a shirt. So these are various kinds of accidents, broadly speaking. So we can say the shirt not only is blue, but it's extra large. It was given to me by my wife. It was created 5 years ago in China. Currently is wrapped around my body. That's the position it takes. Okay. Action. The atoms within the shirt are moving around. right? Now, passion doesn't mean what it typically means, when we use the word passion. It comes from the Latin passus, which means to receive something or to be the object of an action. So anytime I act, when I touch this podium, the podium is being touched. That's the passion. It's being touched. Or when I walk on the floor is being walked on. Or kick the desk is being kicked. That's the passion, right? So action and passion are related to each other. Passion is a recipient of action. Okay, possession is an odd translation of a complicated concept we won't get into. So it's more important that you just get the difference between substance and excellence, okay? So I can make a substantial predication, say this marker, this is a marker, or I can say, make a qualitative predication and say this marker is black. Or I can say this marker is small, quantitative predication, et cetera, all right? Then there are finally ways of predicating. Slightly different from types of predicates. Ways of predicating. There it's important to see that species, the most important part is species is the result of genus plus specific difference. What does that mean? Well, again, genus and species don't mean exactly what they mean in biology, but they have more generic meanings. So genus means the broadest category. It's the broadest category of thing. Except for transcendental, which we'll talk about later, but it's a broad category. And then species is a more restricted category. So we get the species by adding specific differences or other features, attributes to the thing. All right, so an example. Animal. Animal comes from the Latin anima, which means anything that moves around. Okay, so an animal is something that moves around. And we add specific differences. This animal is fuzzy, it has 4 legs, and it barks. Okay, we get the result, species, dog, right? So now, various specific differences there, whatever they are, it doesn't matter. However you want to define something, the way you define something, you start with a genus, a broader category, you add other qualities, and you figure out what the species is from there. Okay, so and then going back up to these accidents, they can be predicated in more or less essential ways. So for example, it's less essential to a dog that it be brown than that it bark. Okay? So the fact that the dog barks, you could say that's a property, because that's an essential thing for a dog. Okay? I don't know if any dog doesn't bark, it's because of some throat disorder or something, right? So the dogs ordinarily bark, so barking is more essential to dogs than being brown, because you can have any number of colored dogs, right? Maybe more essential than being brown, the dog has to have 4 legs. Well, it could have 3 legs, right? But most of the time it has 4 legs. Okay, so the less essential ones are called accidents, so they're more strictly speaking, so like incidental accidents, you might say. Whereas the more essential accidents, okay, like being able to bark, would be called properties. Okay, that's all that is. So that's a little terminology there too. So properties are more essential accidents, and accident, strictly speaking, would be something that exists in the thing, but it doesn't really matter. It doesn't affect the essence of the thing. All right. Any questions? Okay, so last time we talked about the original meaning of science. It comes from the Latin word scientia, which means the knowledge of things through its causes. Knowledge of things through their causes. Okay, through knowledge of their causes. So, and we talked about the 4 causes: material, formal, efficient, and final. So review those, you need to know those. And then we talked about analogy. So quickly, analogy again is between univocity and equivocity. Okay, equivocity is when a word means 2 different things at the same time, or a concept is referring to 2 completely dissimilar things, completely different things. All right. And univocity is the opposite, where the concept applies equally to every member of its class. So, like animal, cats are equally animals as dogs are. Okay. And one isn't more animal than the other. And then analogy is where there's both similarity and dissimilarity between the things you're talking about. Okay. So, for example, I might say that I'm healthy. The doctor might look at my urine and say your urine is healthy because the urine, good health, if the urine has certain properties, it's a sign of good health. Doctor might also say, this is healthy medicine. This is good medicine. This medicine will make you healthy. It'll be the cause of health. Okay? So you can use health in 3 different ways there. And there are lots of different cases where you could do that, with different words, I mean. And that's what's called an analogous concept, or an analogous term. Okay. So the analogy of being is a big theme we'll talk about, especially in the ontological foundations. How everything exists, they have that in common. That's the similarity. But everything exists in a slightly different way, slightly different manner, especially different species, etc. So we went through that hierarchy of being, where God is being itself, and then you have pure minds or pure spirits, and then you have human beings who have intellect and will, but also bodies, and then you have animals, brute animals that don't have reason or will, but have sensation, imagination, memory, etc. We'll go through more of that in the anthropological foundations. And then below that, there's the vegetative life, and below that's just inanimate objects. Okay, so they all exist in different ways, and so being applies to them analogically, meaning they all exist, but they exist in different ways. Okay, so there's kind of a scale of being. Now, we also talked about concepts. So remember, we have the 3 acts of the mind: conceptualization, judgment, inference. Okay? Conceptualization is the process by which we acquire concepts of things. And judgments are the linking of 2 or more concepts, okay, by means of the copula, is or the is not. And then the inference is the 3rd act of the mind, which is the linking of 2 or more judgments together by means of the middle term. Okay, so first we're going to talk about concepts, then we go on to judgments. Real quick review of the concepts. We have comprehension and extension. There's just more terminology here. Comprehension is the unity of its characteristics. In other words, what can we say about the thing? Okay. Extension is how many things does the concept apply to? Okay, so animal has broader extension, has greater extension, but less comprehension than does dog. Okay, dog is more specific. Dog is a species of animal. So you can say more about dog, but it has greater comprehension than animal. But dog applies to less things than does animal, so it has less extension. So animal has greater extension, less comprehension. It applies to more things, but you can say less about what it is. Okay, so being, for example, has the greatest possible extension because it applies to all possible things, but there's very little you can say about it, so it has very little comprehension. Okay, so they're inversely proportional, in other words. All right, so moving on, definition. There are different ways of giving definition. Division is an important part of definition. Division is setting one thing off from another. Okay, so you're saying this is not that. All right. So, but eventually you want to arrive at what the thing is, right? So first you say what it's not, and then after you said that it's not all these things, well, then you arrive at an idea of what it is. But another way to go about defining things is to give a nominal definition. A nominal definition is an etymological definition, meaning you say the linguistic origin of the word that for the concept you're talking about. Okay, so like nominal comes from the Latin word nomen, which means name. So I just gave a nominal definition of the word nominal. Okay, then you have real definition, which is trying to get at the essence of the thing. Okay, and so you can learn about the extrinsic causes, which would be efficient and final causes. But more essential to the thing itself are the intrinsic causes, the formal and the final. Okay, so if you can arrive at an understanding of the causes of the thing, you can define the thing and understand what the thing is and have scientia, or science, of the thing. Now, the most radical form of division, when you're saying what the thing is not, is opposition. And there are different kinds of opposition. Remember, we have contradictories, contraries, relations, and privations. Contradictories are mutually exclusive. They're the most possible opposite pairs. Contraries are not mutually exclusive, but they're kind of extremes on a scale. So like hot water and cold water, or black and white colors. Relations are mutually defining. It's like I'm the father of a daughter. The daughter is a daughter of me, the father. Okay, we're defined in relation to one another. And privation is the absence of something that should be there. So we'll talk about evil later on in the course as the absence of a good that should be there. Okay, so that's a quick review. Moving on now to propositions. So we talked about concepts. Now we're going to talk about judgments. Another word for judgment is proposition. Okay. There are different ways you can classify propositions. So, as you notice, we're using the tool of division to define different kinds of propositions. And we're using some of the 10 categories to help divide the propositions off from one another. So, if we use quality to divide the propositions, we get true and false propositions. Those are two kinds of propositions, or judgments. All right, the judgment can either be true or false. If we use the category of quantity to divide the propositions into different kinds, we get universal or particular. Don't worry about the others. And then if we use the concepts of material and formal causation to divide up types of propositions, we get, as you see there, necessary and possible contingent. You don't have to worry about those. More important, division according to form, affirmative and negative. Don't worry about modal. Okay? So, then, from that, there's a traditional kind of classification of propositions combining some of these elements. So, leaving aside the division according to quality, true or false, we combine the division according to quantity and the division according to form. Okay, so universal particular and affirmative negative. We get 4 kinds of propositions. So those 4 classical kinds of propositions are universal affirmative, universal negative, particular affirmative, particular negative. Now what are those? Now, example, universal affirmative. All dogs are animals. I'm making an affirmation about a group, a class, a large class of things. Okay, universal negative. I negate something about a large class of things. All dogs are not animals. Okay, that's not true, but it doesn't matter for the example, right? So, 3 particular affirmatives. If I say Spot is a dog, that's an affirmative about a particular thing. Spot. This Spot is a dog. All right. Particular negative, Spot is not a dog. Okay? Maybe Spot's a cat. Spot is not a dog, that's a particular negative. So, now, if you remember the types of opposition, we had contradictories, contraries. Now we're going to leave aside privations and relations, which have to do with concepts, and talk about and add subcontraries and subalternates in the context of propositions. Don't worry about those, though. We'll just look at contradictories and contraries. All right. So, how are these various propositions related? Well, first you have to learn the shorthand. So A stands for universal affirmation because A is the first vowel in affirmative. E stands for universal negative because E is the first vowel in negative. That's how I remember them anyway. Now, the third one is I, because that's the next vowel, right? And that's for a particular affirmative. And then the next vowel is O, which is particular negative. So different ways you can remember it, but it goes universal affirmative, universal negative, particular affirmative, particular negative. Okay, so we have A, E, I, and O. We put this little diagram here to help you understand what we're talking about. So we have column 1, affirmative, column 2, negative. Row 1, universal, row 2, particular. So again, A is universal affirmative, and O is particular negative. Those are contradictories because they could not be more opposite. How are they the most opposite? Why are they mutually exclusive? Well, to use an example, A, the universal affirmative, all dogs are animals. Change that to some, change the all to some, change are to are not, and you get some dogs are not animals. Okay, so they differ both in quantity, because one has to do with all and one says something about some. One is a universal, one's a particular. All right. And we also change the form. In other words, one is an affirmation and one is a negation. Okay, so they're complete opposite, A and O. The same is true for I and E. Okay, some dogs are animals and all dogs are not animals. Could not be more opposite. Okay. Now, contraries are a little different. Contraries go this way. So horizontally, you have A and E are contraries. So you have all dogs are animals, all dogs are not animals. So contraries are two extremes on a scale. So one is a negation, the other is an affirmation, but they both have to do with the same quantity, the universal quantity. All right. These are below concerning the particular quantity. These are called subcontraries, and then vertically they're subalternates. It's not so important that you know those. But what is important is to know the laws of opposition, at least the first two. You don't have to worry about subcontraries and subalternates. So we learn contradictories cannot both be true and they cannot both be false together. Okay. Ergo, from the truth of one contradictory, you can conclude the falsity of the other. All right. So it can't be true at the same time that all dogs are animals and some dogs are not animals. Okay. And it can't be false at the same time that all dogs are animals and some dogs are not animals. The same thing goes for E and I. Okay. Contraries, the law of contrariety, or the law of opposition concerning contraries, would be that they cannot be true together. They can't both be true, but they can both be false. So if you look at A and E are contraries, all dogs are animals. All dogs are not animals. They can't both be true, but they can both be false. It can be false that all dogs are animals. It can be false that all dogs are not animals. Maybe some dogs are animals and some are not animals. Okay. Obviously, that's not the case because dogs are animals, right? But we're just giving an example of how that proposition works, how that law of opposition works. All right. So we're presupposing here some fundamental principles, though. So getting to something a little more understandable, perhaps, are common sense principles that are at the foundation of all logic. All right? And so the principle of contradiction says that something cannot be and not be at the same time in the same way. All right? In other words, something cannot be true and false at the same time in the same way. That, some people say, comes from the principle of identity. They're more or less the same. That's why I have a slash there. Identity is that being is being and not being is not being. So if being is being and not being is not being, then, well, something cannot be and not be at the same time in the same way. All right. Excluded middle is another way of saying the same thing pretty much. There's nothing between being and non-being. Something either is or is not. Okay. Now, principle of convenience would be a little harder to see. Two things that agree with a third also agree with each other in the same way that they agree with the third. Okay? Whereas, if only one agrees with the third, there's no agreement between the two. So to give an easy example, if A is B and C is B, obviously A is C. If A is B and C is B, then A is C. Okay? Now to give a more complicated example in theology, you can say the Father, God the Father is God, God the Son is God, God the Holy Spirit is God. So they're all equal, they're all God. But they're all the same in one respect, in one way, insofar as they're all equal to God. In other words, by essence, they're the same. But in a different way, in a different respect, they're not equal. And that's by their relationships to one another. So they're only equal to each other insofar as they're all equal to God, but they're each God in different ways. By their relationship to one another, they're distinct from one another, even though by essence they're identical. So there's a difference between substantial predication and relational predication. All right? That's a little complicated, but it's more important that you know the principle of contradiction and then also the two types of inference. Deduction and induction are the two types of inference. Now, logic has to do with necessary syllogisms, necessary inferences. That's what this logic has to do with. So logic is the science of syllogism, and that's deduction. Okay. Induction is used more in the empirical scientific method. It has to do with probable reasoning, hypothetical syllogisms. So if then, fulfilling the conditions. So induction is going from observation of particular things. So my pen falls, this cup falls, the desk falls if you push it over. So everything falls. So you generalize. Okay, well, it seems like everything falls. Well, what about in outer space? Nothing, they just kind of float around. Well, then you have to, so that's not a necessary conclusion. It's a probable conclusion. Now, induction also occurs when we move from our knowledge of the first principles to then apply them to particular things that we experience. But that's a complicated gnosiological question. Now, just remember that induction is going from the more particular to the more universal, whereas deduction goes from the more universal to the more particular. So, example, all dogs are animals. All animals are furry. Therefore, all dogs are furry. So, we mentioned dogs and furry, and those show up in the conclusion. All dogs are furry. So we'll talk about, why that's the case. But here you're going from something more general. All animals are all dogs are animals. That's a general statement. That's a more universal statement. And in the conclusion, you come up with all dogs are furry. Furry is a more particular thing. So you're deducing a particular truth from a universal truth. Now, last slide, I believe, the various laws of syllogism that come about from this. Don't worry about antecedent consequence. We have a few laws that come about from these things that we've been talking about. So, in order for a syllogism to be valid, there must only be three terms. Major term, minor term, middle term. Middle term we've talked about. It's what links the two judgments together. The major term is the more universal of the two other terms. Okay? And the minor term is the less universal or the more particular. Okay? So we have to avoid equivocation, right, we need the terms must not have greater extension in the conclusion than in the premises. In other words, you can't make here A broader in the conclusion than it was in the first premise, or C a broader category than it was in the second premise. Okay. Now, the middle term also must never show up in the conclusion. So you can't have B here, otherwise there's a problem. Okay. You can't have the middle term in the conclusion. Also, the middle term has to be a universal. Okay, it can't be a particular thing, at least in both cases. Okay. It's got to be universal, at least once, in order to join two judgments together. Because it's got to, something has to include many things before it can join two judgments together. Then you have two affirmative premises cannot give a negative. Okay. So if I say all dogs are animals, all animals are furry, you can't say some dogs are not furry or something. Right. There's no negation there in the premises, so you can't introduce the negation into the conclusion. The premises cannot both be negative. If they're both negative, there's no necessary conclusion. I say all dogs are, ugly, all ugly things. Wait a minute, I need two negatives. So all dogs are not pretty. All not pretty things are not brown. Therefore, what? There's no conclusion from that. Okay, so, and then two premises cannot be both particular. You can't say Fido is a dog and Spot is a dog. Therefore, dog is dog? No, you can't. There's nothing you can say. All right. So, in other words, the conclusion has to follow the weaker part, and you have to have at least one universal premise, and you have to have at least one positive premise. So, if you consider, the negative, the weaker part out of positive and negative, and you consider the particular, the weaker part out of universal and particular, then you have a rule here. You can figure out what the conclusion is without thinking about what you're actually talking about. You can just join these two things mindlessly. Robots can do this. Okay? So machines do this all the time. You can have two universal affirmatives. You can't have two universal negatives because you can't have two negatives. You can't have two particular affirmatives because you can't have two particulars. You can't have two negative particulars because you can't have two negatives and you can't have two particulars. So you got to have a universal affirmative or a universal particular. And then the other one, so in other words, you have to have if you have a universal particular and a universal negative, well then you're going to have a particular negative. Because it follows the weaker part of both, the particular and the negative. Okay. If you have a universal affirmative and a particular affirmative, the conclusion has to be a particular affirmative. If you have a universal affirmative and a universal negative, then the conclusion has to be a universal negative. Okay. So there's different laws of syllogism there. The rest I will leave alone.